and have invited along, and they've got over 100 people coming along to that. So that'll be a great event this afternoon from 4 o'clock. Games and quiz and food and lots of fun for those who come along. We have in the past done these series planning meetings, and we are currently in a series that finishes at the end of November. But before we move to our next series, we'd like to give an outline of where we're going and to think about what it means for us to be a community and engage in those topics, those series. Think creatively, think about what it means for our community.
Amen. Amen. Please have a seat, everyone. If there's any kids here, you can head upstairs. Kids' Life starts now, and your teachers will be up there waiting for you. Thank you, Maggie. The rest of us, you might want to turn to 2 Samuel chapter 1, if you're following the booklets, or in your Bibles, 2 Samuel chapter 1. What do you say when something unexpectedly unwanted happens to you? You ever find yourself just like speaking out loud almost to yourself? Like something comes out of your voice, or am I the only weird person here? You just sort of, something comes out. These things happened and you just spontaneously react. Do we have sound?
Good grief. Good grief. Good grief.
One more.
Good grief.
Good grief.
Good grief.
This thing's blown up, so we'll just do our best. Good grief. That's something I love to say. I don't know why. Maybe I grew up with Charlie Brown, but it just comes out. It feels good to say good grief. You've got to say something, and I just find that, I don't know why, it's comforting to say good grief. Poor old Charlie Brown had to say it quite frequently. It's apparently a euphemism, according to the Dictionary of Idiom, for good God. And you shouldn't say God, so you say good grief instead. It's expressing unhappiness that something has happened. So it's not so good. But it feels good to say this thing. But I think if you dig deeper, maybe Charles Schulz, who did Peanuts, he was a Christian man, had this idea that it's saying something has happened that's disordered with the goodness that underlies the universe, the godness that underlies the universe, and somehow it's out of whack. And it's an expression of longing that things would be better than they are. Do you know that feeling? Something's happened and you think, I just want this thing not to have happened and things to be as I think they should be. It's an expression of hope as well as discomfort. My question to you is this: how do we deal with unwanted reality, given what we know about God and the world? How do we move on when bad things have happened? Terrible things do happen to us in our lives. What do we do with that? That's what we're going to look at today, because that's where we're up to in our passage. You've been here, and hopefully this thing will work. Maybe I'll just point Maggie and I'll get you to flick it on, because that's mucking up. If you look back at 1 Samuel chapter 30, we've got the story where the Philistine king, Achish, has been insisting on behalf of his military that David, who's been with him, goes back home to Ziklag, the town that he's put aside for him, because Achish is going up with his army to face King Saul, and they're going to have a showdown. And his generals are worried that David's going to turn and join the Israelites instead of fighting with Achish. So he sends him home to Ziklag. When they get there, they find the Amalekites have overrun their town, burned it to the ground, taken wives and children and departed. If you're here last week, we read how David then goes chasing them, finds them in the wilderness, fights them, defeats them, takes everyone back home, and from grief they turn to joy. Simultaneously, I think the same day that David is fighting the Amalekites, Achish is up fighting Saul. And they meet, thanks Maggie, in chapter 31 on the Jezreel Valley floor. The Philistines roll out their great war chariots. They have this Iron Age advantage, and they totally overrun the Israelites, slaughtering them. The rout ensues, and so Saul and a few of his men flee up into the hills of Mount Gilboa. And so the Philistines send up their archers and start raining down arrows on these cowering Israelites. Saul, we read, is shaking in fear. But rather than submit to death, or perhaps worse, capture and torture by the Philistines, he says to his armor bearer, David used to have that job, but he's got a new guy now, he says, "Please, will you kill me?" And the guy says, "No, you're the Lord's anointed, you're the king, I'm not going to kill you." So Saul gets his own sword and falls upon it and kills himself. The army is overrun. All the territory that they've captured is brought back under the control of the Philistines. It's a total rout. It's a total defeat. And well may we say, good grief, what a mess. The writer exposes the shameful extent of Saul's defeat, that it hasn't been David, it hasn't been the Philistines that have ended his reign. He's done it to himself. And his death sort of pictures his whole life. He has destroyed his own kingdom. And the implement, his sword, has been the thing that is used against his enemies. He's turned it upon himself. It's humiliating, this defeat that he faces. Good grief. But death is not the end for Saul. His fear was that the Philistines would mistreat him. Well, they do something worse. They come upon his body, they decapitate him, they take his armour, just as David had done with Goliath, and they take his body and nail it up on the wall of a city. They nail it up with the bodies of his 3 sons, including Jonathan. They are all slaughtered. Good grief. Normal Israelite practice was to bury bodies, but some men, loyal men, hear what's happened to Saul, go and rescue his body, bravely take it back, and I think it's so corrupt and stinking that they have to burn the corpse. And then they take his bones and intern those. The final image we have of Saul is of rotting, corrupt flesh. This is the last image we have of this man's life. Total defeat, total failure, good grief, we say. While all this is happening, what's David doing? David is back in Ziklag, and 2 Samuel chapter 1 opens with him back with wives and children in his stronghold, when suddenly a man comes to him. His clothes are torn, his head covered with dust, with mud, with ash, the signs of mourning. And he falls at David's feet as a sign of respect. And he says, David, I've come to bring you some horrible, horrible news. And he's going to tell the story of what has happened to Saul. But the story he tells is very different to what I've just told you, which is what we read in the last chapter of 1 Samuel. The man says that I, just by happenstance, by chance, walked upon a battlefield. And I sort of wandered up and I found myself next to King Saul. And he was there leaning on his javelin, like a staff, like a walking stick. And he said to me, who are you? And the man said, well, I said, I'm an Amalekite. Oh, says Saul, then you can do me a favour, because I'm going to ask you to do something that no Israelite would do. I'm going to ask you to kill me. And the man said, oh, okay then. I'll finish you off. Euthanasia. And he gets the javelin, he gets the spear, and plunges it in Saul, and he falls over dead. The man takes the regalia, the crown from Saul's head, and the armband that signal that he is the king, and he brings them back and he gives them to David. Look, here I am. I've brought you a present, because maybe you're the new king. Good grief. What's going on here? This, again, a horrible picture of the demise of Saul. That he's killed by, of all people, the Amalekites. These people that he has lost his kingdom over because he's failed to wipe them out. Remember the dead Samuel brought back at Endor? Again reminding him, you failed, you failed, you failed. Well, he's done it, not by a Philistine, but an Amalekite has finished Saul's reign. Total, shameful failure. But you've probably picked up the contradiction. Which of these 2 stories is true? Our books of 1 and 2 Samuel in the Hebrew are just one book. They were only broken into 2 in the 15th century because in the Hebrew text it was too long to put in one book. And so they said, well, let's just put a pause here. But in the original, one flows immediately onto the next. And so they're obviously contradictory. What's happening here? Some people say, well, there's 2 sources and we've just got 2 accounts of the same event and you've got to choose which one you like. I think it's a bit more clever than that. I think we should see that this guy is lying. He's intentionally presenting himself as someone in grief, but he has another agenda. If you look at 2 Samuel chapter 1, you'll see that the narrator keeps saying, David's asking questions, and he keeps saying, and the man says this, and the man says this, and then he goes on and says this. Let's do a bit of detective work. Let's do some true crime. Anyone into true crime? Me either. Anyway, we're going to do some. Do you really think this man would just wander into the midst of a battle? Like, is he blind and deaf? How believable is this story? And could he just wander up next to the king and say, oh, look, I bumped into you, Saul? Is that a believable thing? And to stand next to the king when he's under this rain of arrows and walk out alive, is that realistic? Back in 1 Samuel 31, we'll read that Saul's armour bearer, after Saul has died, kills himself as well because he knows there's no hope for us. Life is over. And if Saul didn't want to be killed by the Philistines, he's much less going to want to be killed by the Amalekites. These are the people over whom he's lost his kingdom. This is not believable. The man is lying. Why is he lying? Because he thinks he's bringing David good news. That David will be happy now that his rival is dead, and now I can become king. And look, here's the symbols of kingship, and maybe you'll reward me. Far more likely is that this guy was a scavenger. He gets to the dead body of Saul. His arm is too heavy to carry, so he just takes the crown and the amulet around his arm and brings these back because he wants to ingratiate himself to King David. Can I live here in Israel as an Amalekite and be safe? Because you are the new king. He's using disaster for his own benefit. But how does David respond? Because David doesn't have 1 Samuel 31. He only has this guy's account. This is the news that's come to him. Well, the text doesn't say whether he believes them, but I guess you can see by what David does. He shoots the messenger immediately. He says, who do you think you are to kill the Lord's anointed, buddy? And he says to his men, finish him. And so this guy dies. What a mess. Good grief. I think when we anticipate and think about the life of God's anointed person, this is not what we would expect the story to look like. And as readers, we say, what is going on here? God had chosen this man to be his representative. He'd picked him out. He'd sent Samuel to say, you are the one. And look at how it's ended. What's the purpose of this story? All of this drama leads to this. What is going on? I think we should say with Charlie Brown, good grief. Good grief. How should we respond? How does David and his men respond to what has happened? I'm halfway through. You'll be delighted to know. I want us to look at how they respond because I think they are a model for us about how we should respond in times of grief. What we should do. This is what we read. Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David and his men very intentionally engage in a process of grieving. They do something. Why do they do that? Let me say something that sounds wrong, but I think is right, and that we're going to spend the rest of our time examining. The reason that David behaves this way is because he knows grieving is actually good. Grieving is actually good. And you say, John, no one wants grief. It's always uninvited and unwanted. How can it be good? I say it's good for this reason. Loss and pain are unwanted, but they come. And we need to deal with that. Emotionally, relationally, spiritually. Grieving is the process by which we adjust to this unwanted reality. If we do not grieve well, we do not live well. Because stuff happens in life, whether we want it or not, and we have to adapt to it. We can do it poorly, or we can do it well. And I want to take just a few pointers from David's example that help us to do it well together. actively grieving well is good. It's how we continue on in life in light of our pain and loss. Pain and loss has happened. What are we going to do with it? Well, the process, the healthy process, is to engage in grief together. Learning how to do that well is a task for all of us, because all of us face grief, big and small. Things happen to us as we go through life to which we must respond. Let's learn how to do that together. I think of grief like this. It's sort of like a bridge. It takes me from the past loss, the event that's happened, into the future. It enables me to walk on. If I stay back in the mess, in the mud of the past, I can't live anymore. Grieving is the process, the bridge that allows me to deal with what's happened so that I can continue to live well. That's what we're going to learn about today. 3 very quick things. I think good grief includes expressing our emotions. That's what we see David and the others doing together. But they do them in culturally specific ways. How we express our emotions is shaped by our culture. All human beings have emotions, but how we express them, whether they're anger or shame or other things, joy or grief, sadness, pain, are shaped by our culture. And that's what we saw in David's example. That's what we talked about. We had our reading group on Tuesday. And one guy said, in my culture, when I was growing up, the message I got was, in times of grief, control yourself. Don't get into your emotions too much, because then they will control you. Just control yourself, contain everything, and just let it dissipate. Because if you feel too much, you'll be overwhelmed, and then you'll embarrass yourself. And the message that he took from this was, don't feel. Do everything to squash down your feelings, because you should be embarrassed by them. And he said that's an incredibly unhelpful message to receive, and I agree with him. That is not what David and his men do. They express their emotions. What should a Christian response be to grief? Because we live in a subculture that teaches us things about how to deal with it. I've been to lots of funerals. It's an occupational hazard. And I talk to lots of people in times of grief. And many people, Christian people, want to say to me, I want a funeral that's triumphant. I want it joyful. I want rejoicing. Because the person's run the race, they've got the finish line, and they're with God now. They're with the angels, or whatever else. And I think, well, there's some truth in that, enough to be dangerous. Because the reality is, if you love someone, it hurts when they're gone. Why should we pretend otherwise? Yes, they are safe in the arms of Jesus, but they're not in our arms anymore. We've lost them. They're gone. Can I not hold those two things together? Yes. Paul says we grieve, but not like those who don't have hope, but we still grieve. I think of the example of Jesus. If anyone knew about the resurrection, it was Jesus. He went to the tomb of his friend Lazarus, knowing he's about to raise him from the dead. And what does Jesus do? He weeps. He expresses his emotion. Let's not use the hope of the resurrection as a hammer to bang down our feelings. Yes, we have reasons not to grieve as those who have no hope grieve, but we still grieve. And we need to express that emotion in appropriate ways, otherwise it's dangerous to us. Steve spoke, again, I commend you to go back and look at these sermons about the idea of temperance, of balancing things rightly. And I think wisdom is always sort of getting the balance right. Yes, we have some hope, but we also have some sadness. And both must have their place in our life. I think this idea maybe came from Augustine. You know, that guy, he had lots of interesting notions, some really helpful, some less. So he was into Greek philosophy. And so he brought into Christianity this idea of the soul escaping the body when we die. Not a Christian notion. It's not our hope, the immortal soul. But that was his thinking. And it was useful to him, or he thought so, when his best friend Nebridius died. And he started to feel guilty that he was sad. And he said, oh, I'm attaching myself to the things of the earth, and that's wrong. And then his mum, Monica, dies. And he's overwhelmed by grief, as well as guilt and other things. And so he started this idea to say the Christian response is not to be sad in the face of death because we have hope in the immortal soul. And so Christian tradition at funerals brings in this idea of you just must be happy because that's what faith looks like. And I think that's an incredibly unhelpful approach for us to take. Does that make sense? We need to express and be with our emotions in ways that are suitable for us. David's culture was an expressive culture. If they were happy, they danced. They sang songs. We're a little bit more shame-driven in our culture, and we're a bit more private. Our culture says, yeah, you express your emotions, but do it privately, don't do it publicly. Western culture says, yeah, you can cry at the funeral and that's it. Deal with your problems at home and don't let anyone see it. I don't think that's a helpful way to deal with hard things. I think we need to learn as a community to shape a culture that says you can just be. And acknowledge that none of us fit the cultural norm. We're all different. We all have our personalities. Some people don't fit in their culture. And that's a good thing. That's the value of a multicultural society. You learn that, well, there are other ways to do things than what I was taught. We allow that diversity because there is no normal grief. We all grieve in our own ways. And we must be patient with one another and accept one another and affirm one another. For our extremes of emotion are extremes of no emotion because they're both normal too. Grief is not some process, and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, you're probably familiar with her stages of grief that's misrepresented as you go through these like a train goes through stations. You have anger and this and this and this. That's not how grief works. It's like a storm that comes rolling through your life and you go on the cycle. And for the one person you've lost, you grieve over and over and over and over and over and over for the rest of your life. Because each memory of them brings up more stuff. And you learn to process it better and better over time. But it's still there. And then every other grief that you experience comes in and gets piled on top of that. And it all mixes in. That's life for us, isn't it? You mightn't like the sound of that, I'm sorry, but that's what happens to us. How do we respond well to that is what we can learn together. And that, I think, is what this passage can teach us. Good grief, secondly, includes facing mixed feelings. Thanks, Maggie. Consider the situation for David at Saul's death. What's been their relationship? This guy has been trying to kill him for a decade and a half. He's forced him to live out in the wilderness on the margins of society. That situation has caused David to make some huge moral compromises. He's thrown his lot in with the Philistines, their arch enemy. He's been a raider and a marauder and a murderer to survive. The cost of Saul's opposition to David has been huge. And I think part of David must feel relief to hear at last this guy is dead. Why would he lament? Why would he mourn the loss of Saul? Their relationship has been toxic. If you have a toxic relationship and the person dies, it's very hard to say that though, isn't it? To say, oh, now I can start recovering. But some of us experience that. Or maybe not that extreme, but have hard things in our relationship. I tossed up whether I tell personal stories today or not, and I'm probably going to run out of time, so I'll come to the course. I'll get to that in a minute. But all of us, I think, face things in death with a person that we've had a complex relationship with mixed feelings. It's not just sadness, is it? There's guilt, or there's shame, or there's anger, or there's bitterness, or there's confusion, or there's resentment. All of these things mix in with our grief. And we've got to pick our way through all of these feelings at the one time. It's hard. We have mixed feelings. Think of the circumstances of Saul's death. Why did Saul die? Because he was overwhelmed by the Philistines. He couldn't face them. Where was David? He'd been sent home from that battle by the Philistine generals in case he had aligned himself with Saul. If he had been there, maybe Saul would never have died. Maybe they would have won that battle. What feelings does that bring for David? Am I responsible in some way for the death of this man? Sometimes we feel that we were unable to do anything to help a person in their time of need. And so we are left with this sense of unfinished business with them. Even if we know someone is about to die. David didn't. It was a shock. It just happened. And sometimes people die tragically and we have no chance to have a conversation with them. But even if you do, if you're in a palliative care situation and you have those conversations, or someone in hospital and you both know they're dying, you still feel like, oh, I just wanted to say one more thing. Or there was one bit I'd never got to say properly. Or at least that's my experience of being with dying people, that I just wanted one more chance. And that unfinished business is very hard to sit with. And sometimes we let the last few days or the last few hours become the picture of the person for us. Again, at funerals, often you hear the eulogy and they'll talk forever about the last day that the person was with them, the last conversation. I think, but you've had a whole life. Why let that overshadow and be the whole picture? Because that's not the reality of your relationship. We need perspective. And the process of grieving allows us to get that perspective. Not just to be limited by one regret or one day in time, but to see things in their totality. And think of the real circumstances of Saul's death. How did Saul die? Suicide. Ultimately, we must call it suicide. That fierce goodbye that people choose. There's a surprising number of suicides in the Bible. There's Saul here. There's Abimelech, the son of Gideon, in Judges chapter 9. He likewise chooses euthanasia. There's Samson, who brings down upon his enemies and his own ruined life the building to crush him in humiliation in Judges 16. Ahithophel in 2 Samuel 17, we'll get to this story, one of David's advisors who at a drunken party betrays him and he's rejected, and so he says, well, I'm over, I kill myself. King Zimri, another drunken party in 1 Kings 16, there's a bit of a theme here. He assassinates the other leaders in a bloodbath. Then he's besieged for his actions, and so he burns his house down on himself rather than be taken by the mob. And then, of course, we get to the New Testament and we have the most famous suicide of Judas. What stands out to me in all of these accounts is that nowhere is the person condemned for this action. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying suicide is a good thing. It's a very violent action that harms those who are left. But it's not some other category of sin. Again, this idea came from Augustine. He said this is breaking the sixth commandment, it's self-murder. I don't think that's appropriate. We want to offer better ways to people so that they don't choose that path for whatever reason they choose it. But we shouldn't reject or blame or condemn someone. We want to respond with compassion. But it makes death complicated, doesn't it? And some of you have been in that situation of losing someone by that way. You have very mixed feelings about what has gone on. Grief is complicated. They're just some examples, but I guess the take-home message is this. Grief is normal. Grief is to be expected because death is normal. Death happens to all of us. It will happen to everyone that you love. Either you will die first or they will. We cannot avoid it. We need to deal with it. Loss is part of living. Which brings us to the key thing that I want to talk about today, and the last thing. Grief, good grief, includes learning to lament. Look at what the writer says to us in 2 Samuel. Thanks, Maggie. David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and Jonathan his son. And he said it should be taught to the people of Judah. Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. Faced with death, faced with loss and pain, what does David do? He expresses himself in poetic song. He writes a lament, a psalm. And not only that, he says, I want all of you, my men, to learn it. I am teaching you to express your pain. I am teaching you to lament. It's written in the book of Jasher. We don't have that book. It's mentioned, though, elsewhere in the Bible, Joshua chapter 10. The Israelites had many ancient books. If you read Kings and Chronicles, they're always referring to other books. We haven't got that book, but we've got a book of laments, the book of Psalms. I think you'll know the most common type of psalm is not praise and thanksgiving, it's lament. Almost 70% of the whole book is lament. Complaints to God, cries to God. Why is this happening, God? Please do something, God. Laments. This is the most common type of psalm. Why? What's a lament? A lament is an expression of pain and of hope. It's saying, how do I make sense and go on with all that is happening when I want something else? And it's letting those feelings out. When you lament a person, you are rounding out your experience of life with them. You're saying, this is what they meant to me. This is what they did for me. This is what I'm missing from having them with me. And this is what I wish. That's a lament. It's being thankful for that past. It's saying, this happened, they did this, and I'm hanging on to that. And that allows me to live in the present, acknowledging that loss, to move forward into the future by treasuring up memories of them. That's how we retain connection with the dead. Because a person who has been significant in your life is not gone from your life when they die. Maybe I'll give this example. My father died. The last conversation I had with him was on my 50th birthday, big day, sitting in the hospital. We're having a conversation. He didn't know it was my 50th birthday. We weren't talking about that. And I leave, and 2 days later he's dead. But that's the last time, because then he's in a coma. He's got kidney failure. And I think there are lots of things I wanted to say to my dad, and now the chance is gone. Lots of things I wish I did with my dad, but now the chance is gone. But over the time that's come after that, I've realised it's not gone. Because he appears to me all the time, and you think I'm crazy, but I'm not. You'll have these experiences. I have these dreams, and we have conversations in the dream. And he tells me things I didn't know. And I think, how did I? But they're true things. And I say things to him, or I remember things about him, or I'm doing stuff in the kitchen or the garden or whatever, and suddenly my dad appears to me in my mind. I don't really see him. And I think, that is his legacy. Or I look at myself in the mirror and I think, gee, John, you're looking like your father, you know? Or you have those same strange mannerisms that used to annoy me. You're doing them too. His legacy is still in me. And so I still relate with him in that sense. And I start to treasure the things, the good things, but there were also difficult things with my dad, conflicts that we had, stuff that I've had to work through and let go. That's what happens when we lament. We're trying to get a hold on the person we've lost. And that's what David does here. And I'm going to finish with his lament. What does he actually say? People are getting sick of me saying, picking on David. I'm going to do it again, I'm sorry. David is always a political guy. He's always got an eye for who's watching and who's listening. He's just come into a situation where the Lord's anointed, the king is gone, and he's been chosen as the next anointed, and is he going to be accepted and received? And so he's with the people in the south, the people of Judah, and the people of the north, the people of the Israel, have just lost their king, and he's thinking, right, how do I connect these people up and win their loyalty and become the next king? Last chapter we see he gives gifts to the people of Judah, the rulers of Judah, all the stuff that he's won from the Amalekites. Here he wants to say, wasn't it great we had a leader in the north, the king of Israel? Because he wants to get these people on side so that they will support him. So just keep that in mind as you listen to David's lament. But he also does say some wonderful things. My reading of David is like I read a story yesterday about Picasso, who was a ratbag of a person that did wonderful paintings. Abusive, sexual predator type, not a nice guy. But you've got to say, well, maybe I've got to separate the art from the artist. I think that's the case with David. What he writes is just fantastic, but he was a ratbag of a person. Anyway, let's go on to his lament. Listen to what he says. Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. You mountains of Gilboa, that's where they had the battle, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. Can't you acknowledge what's happened? You can't have crops anymore, you're going to be barren. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. That word anointed means Messiah. He's using a picture of Saul's leather shield on the top of the wood, unoiled. He's saying this is the picture. His kingship has dried up like his shield has. He's no longer Messiah. He's no longer anointed one. Very clever. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. They fought till the end. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death, they were not divided. Really? Father twice tried to kill son. Son abandoned his loyalty to his father to follow David. Maybe meeting at funerals where the eulogy gilds the lily. David's doing the same thing here. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant you have been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. We talked about that when we looked at Jonathan's friendship with David some weeks ago, so I won't go into that again. Third time, how the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war perished. The abiding image, the tools of war left in the dust. The kingdom has ended, but he's creating a memory. He wants people to look up to Saul. All the benefits he gave to you. He was a great man, wasn't he? No. If you read the story, he was a total failure. Why is David doing this? Because he's a shrewd politician. This is for public consumption. But nonetheless, what he says is beautiful. And he's uniting people. And that's what lamenting does. It unites people, brings them together in their grief. Thanks, Maggie. The Christian tradition is one of an embodied expression of grief. We be with each other. That's the sort of culture we want to create with one another so that we can walk through these times together. That we're not ashamed if we get emotional or out of control. That we're not embarrassed by uncomfortable feelings or thoughts. That we can be real with those things and give one another time. Not say, get over it. Not say, calm down. Not say, don't be sad. Not say, oh, they're with the angels or whatever other nonsense we want to say. It's to be as we are, but then find within that God's presence. Because every lament, and this is why Scripture is so useful for us, whatever the background to this story, every lament is an expression to God. Do you notice in that song, nowhere is God mentioned? Not once does David mention God. On its own, that's not a bad thing, because laments are expressions to God. It's an awareness that God is hearing what I'm saying. But I think maybe he's careful because he doesn't want to connect in their minds, what is God doing here? Because remember how all it started with Saul? Samuel said this idea of having a king is a bad idea. And maybe they'll think, yeah, it didn't work, let's go back to the prophets. David, we're not having you either. So he's a clever boy, this David. But as an expression of how to lament, I think this is very helpful. How we do that with one another helps or hinders each other. The book we're reading, Eugene Peterson, has this wonderful point. He says that grief is not just private. It's social and political. It forms culture and how we relate to each other. Why? Because what I do with my grief affects the way you handle your grief. Together we form a community that deals with death and other loss in the context of God's sovereignty, which is expressed finally in resurrection. We want to form a community that has hope and yet can be real. That's the temperance of grief, the wisdom of grief. How do I go through that, and how do I help others go through that? It's a skill we learn. It's a life skill. But it's hard to learn. That's why we're going to run this course. Thanks, Maggie. So if you put up with me, I'm the one that's going to run the course. And so we'll have a seminar that introduces some ideas about grief, and then we'll work together as a small group. And sometimes it's uncomfortable. But mostly it's wonderful because it's sharing our lives with each other. If you want to come to that, go to eNews and register, and we'll do this. Next year we're going to do it for kids and teenagers. There's training courses that I've had to do to run this course. It's a proper course, and I've got that coming up soon. This is a skill we all need, and you're never too old to learn. So I'd invite you to think about coming if you can. For time. Do you want to listen to a song? I want to finish with a song. It's a confronting topic. And if you're raw with grief, then I'm sorry if you've come here thinking, oh, gee, I wish I didn't come to church today. So I just want to give you time just to sit with that. But I'm going to play you a song that's got its own little introduction. There's a bit of a talk that has a picture. If grief is a bridge, it's a bridge that goes down. And sometimes we get scared of walking. Maybe you've walked on those bridges like that. You think, oh, I'm going to go down. I'll never come back up. Here's a song that speaks about going down and not being scared to go down, because when you go right down, who is there? There's someone there that understands your grief just as you are. Someone will explain this song and then you can listen. Thanks, Matt.
In the Mediterranean Sea. If you were to go and swim to a certain place, you'd find a very interesting sculpture. And it's a sculpture by an Italian sculptor named Guido Giletti. And the sculpture is a full-size sculpture of Jesus Christ. His arm is raised up in the air. But rather than displaying this sculpture in a museum or in a church or in a promenade, this sculpture is installed at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. And the only way to see it is to swim down, down, down. And the further you go down, the closer you'll be to seeing Jesus looking up and reaching upward to us. And while there are many songs that give voice to what it is to ascend to the hill of the Lord, to find Jesus at the heights, the Bible also tells us that when we go down to the depths, that he is already there. And so we want to share this song with you. It's called Christ is Lower Still.
remarkable truth that as we are in the depths, that you will be there with us. Father, meet those who are in the depths right now. And be a comfort, and be a presence, and be a hope. Father, I ask that you would make us a community that would know how to be with people in these places. You would help us to know how to be in these places with one another too. Shape us, mold us, let us live the fullness of the life that you are calling us to live. Thank you, Father, for one another. Thank you for the hope that you give us. And I bless each person as we walk out of this room now, and give us strength for the week that we have ahead. Amen.